6:30. So what I'm going to do is to introduce Professor Anthony Reddie, and then I'll be handing over to him. So thank you for giving up some of your evening to join us, and thank you so much, Anthony, for joining us. So Professor Anthony Reddie is the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture in Regent's Park College, which is in the University of Oxford. He's also an extraordinary professor of theological ethics and a research fellow with the university in South Africa. Anthony is the first Black person to get an A rating in theology and religious studies in the South African National Research Foundation, designating him a leading international researcher. He has a BA in history and a PhD in education with theology, both degrees conferred by the University of Birmingham. Anthony is a prolific author of books, articles, and chapters in edited books. He is the author of the Theology of the Brexit, a liberationist and post-colonial critique. This book is the first intercultural and professional theological exploration of the Brexit phenomenon. I need to read that one. And Anthony's previous book was Journeying to Justice, co-edited with Hudson Roberts and Gail Richards. He is the Archbishop of Canterbury's 2020 Lambeth Lanfranc. Have I pronounced that correctly? Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship, given for exceptional and sustained contribution to the Black theology in Britain and beyond. So with all of that, it really is an honor to have you with us, Anthony. So today, Anthony will be talking to us about the absurd necessity of Black Lives Matter, a Black theology reappraisal. Over to you, Anthony.
Thank you. It's very gratifying when people give up their time to come and listen to you, particularly as given how busy we are, and given that in terms of using this particular format of Zoom, that one could be literally be doing anything else rather than this. Anyway, so I hope that your time will be rewarded. An easy way to sum up this sense of the absurd necessity of Black Lives Matter is simply to recount a very obvious fact that is often hidden in plain sight in terms of my and the identity of many diaspora and African people. I'm called Anthony Reddie. R-E-D-D-I-E is not an African name. It's a Scottish name. And what that name says is, or what it indicates is, that at some point about 250, 300 years ago, someone from Scotland, a white person, owned, wasn't a servant, owned as if they were a chattel or a beast of burden or an object, owned one of my descendants and gave them the name Reddie. I say it's hidden in plain sight because we now often operate as if there's no significance of that. And so I'm always interested when I see television programs like So Who Do You Think You Are? Where people go back into their past to retrace their ancestry. And for many of us, particularly those of diaspora and African perspectives, that's difficult and it's painful because we go back and we hit a buffer called slavery. A few months ago, we saw the publication of the latest report actually by the Church of England in terms of tackling racism, from lament to action. I think I remember just prior to it coming out, because aspects of it were leaked, were the number of pushback from conservative right-wing Anglicans saying that essentially that the report was full of Marxist propaganda. And one of the central, I guess, recommendations is that Black theology should be taught more in our theological colleges and should be more operative within the church. And there are a number of very, very sort of right-wing polemicists who were attacking me on social media, particularly on Twitter, because actually one of my books was cited as one of the texts that people should read, which obviously is very gratifying. Probably helped my bank balance a little bit as well. So that Black theology was nothing but a left-wing anti-Christian ideology that comes after critical race theory. Utter nonsense. As I will demonstrate in a moment, the roots of Black theology come out of the Bible. They come out of the scriptures. They come out of a God who has always been on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized. The reason why I think white conservative people don't see it is because Christianity has been cloaked under the guise of white supremacy for about 1500 years. And so for many white British people, as I'll show in a moment, empires become such a normative way of thinking about the Christian faith that even though we open the scriptures and we see a God who is on the side of the marginalized and oppressed, and a God who is critiques and challenges empire, when the empire itself is a Christian one, somehow we don't see that what is hidden in plain sight is that the God revealed in Jesus is not a God of power, is not a God of empire, is not a God of forced oppression upon other people, which is the reality of an empire in which Christianity played a central part. David Livingstone, a famous explorer of Southern Africa, in a speech in Oxford in 1857, said that the basis of the British Empire was the 3 C's. And that was essentially commerce, civilization, and Christianity. Christianity becomes the theological and philosophical underscoring for commerce and civilization of empire. So much so that when my parents come to Britain in the late 50s as part of the Windrush of the Windrush experience, part of the Windrush generation, they come as communicant members of a church into which they had been missionized. So actually they came as Baptists. And they came with blue passports because Jamaica, for which they came as part of the British Empire, been a crown colony from 1694 right through to 1962. Therefore, it's important. Therefore, to talk about Black History Month, I think it's good to have a month where we remember the Black contribution, but actually, every month should be Black History Month, because you can't look at British history without understanding its relationships to other parts of the world, particularly to all those bits in pink on older globes and maps. That is central to understanding of what it is to be British. It's not simply within these islands, it's about colonization, it's about expansion, in which the Christian faith in general and Anglicanism in particular plays a key role. So the roots of Black theology don't lie in any secular ideology. They lie in the experience of enslaved peoples to see that when they read the scriptures, eventually for themselves, for many years it was illegal for enslaved people to read the Bible. And there's a famous artifact called the Slave Bible that was created by slave owners, instructing missionary people to take out all the bits in the Bible that might imply freedom for people who are oppressed. Once the enslaved people began to get hold of the Bible, began to learn to read for themselves, what they saw was a God who seemed to side with people like them, not with the people who were exploiting them. The most famous Black theology book of all, I think, is written by James Cone, who is the grand architect, the founding father of Black liberation theology. In 1975, he wrote a book called God of the Oppressed. And in God of the Oppressed, what Cone shows is time and time again that the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is a God who sides with the marginalized and those who are oppressed. So when we look at the Exodus narrative and we see the Hebrew people taken into slavery in Egypt, God, through Moses, says to Pharaoh to let my people go. And whilst those people are Jewish people, they may well be people of color, but they're certainly not white people. But the enslaved people never said that those are us. What they said was, if God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and if the God revealed in the scriptures is one who is siding on the side of the oppressed Hebrews, not on the side of Pharaoh, then that God has to be, if God is consistent to God's nature and being, then that same God will be on our side. That God will be with us in our struggles, even in the midst of plantation experience, often overseen and colluded by missionaries. Now, to be clear, not every missionary was on the side of the plantocracy and on the side of slavery. But the truth is the majority were. The only Christian church, I think, that does not have blood on its hands in terms of exploitation and slavery are probably the Quakers. But every other denomination, so in my own, in terms of being Methodist, John Wesley was very clear that Methodists should not hold slaves, but Methodists in the Caribbean and Americas ignored it because there was just too much money to be made in order to turn aside from the lure of mammon and from greed, from exploitation. There's a famous book written in 1944 by famed Caribbean historian called Eric Williams. And the book is called Capitalism and Slavery. First published in 1944 by Andre Deutsch, been in print ever since. And what Eric Williams shows in his book, Capitalism and Slavery, is that you do not get the Industrial Revolution if you don't first have slavery that provides the capital, provides the raw material of resources that enables Britain then to innovate, and many other countries to innovate in the 19th century. So the basis of modern capitalism is slavery. It is the enslavement of my ancestors. But something magical happens when enslaved people are introduced to the gospel. Ostensibly, they're introduced to it in the order to make them better slaves. But what the slave owners did is to take exploitative texts out of context. So particularly Paul's letters about slavery, particularly, well, three key texts. So Colossians 3:22, Ephesians 6:5, Paul's letter to Philemon, in which in all three, slaves are encouraged to obey their masters. And in the case of Onesimus, who runs away, Paul sends him back to Philemon. Now, Mitley sends him back and says, treat him as a brother in the faith, but does not command that Philemon should set Onesimus free. And therefore, those texts taken out of context, there's a whole literature on how we read Pauline texts in terms of the issue around slavery. We don't have time to get into that. That's a whole subgenre of itself in terms of Black and womanist theology and hermeneutics. But the fact is, whatever Paul meant in his particular time, what we do know is that exploitative white Christians took those texts at face value and said, well, clearly within the economy of Christianity, slavery is not abhorrent. And it seems perfectly logical that one can worship God revealed in Jesus Christ, be faithful to the scriptures and to the church, and still hold slaves and make a profit. So slaves were expected to be passive and supine, but what happened was that what they discovered in the power of the Holy Spirit was a God that did not side with the oppressors, but side with themselves as the people who were oppressed. And key to this wasn't just the stories of the Exodus and the stories of the God who says to the Egyptians to let my people go in terms of the Hebrew Israelites. Most convincingly for them, they looked at Jesus' own life. And they particularly looked at the way in which he dies in terms of crucifixion. And that for them said, well, that is analogous to how we die. We die pitiless deaths at the hands of powerful vested interests. And we identify Jesus' own life and in his struggles, but particularly in his death, we resonate with our own experience. And what then became key for them was that if Jesus could be resurrected and could overcome death, then they believed themselves to be identified with Jesus, that in their faith, they would also escape the ultimate death as well. I want to read what, for me, I think has been one of the key foundational texts for the development of Black liberation theology. This comes from the scriptures. This is John's account of Jesus before Pilate. This is John 18, verses 28 to 40. Then they brought Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate came out to them and said, "What accusation are you bringing against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." So Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." Now bear that thought in mind. We'll come back to that in a moment. We are not permitted to put anyone to death. This happened so that the word of which Jesus had said, indicating what kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Therefore Pilate entered the praetorium again and summoned Jesus and said to him, "You are the king of the Jews." Jesus answered, "Are you saying this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." So therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this purpose have been born, and for this I have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After saying this, he came out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no grounds at all for charges in his case. However, you have a custom that I release one prisoner for you at the Passover. Therefore, do you wish that I release for you the king of the Jews?" So they shouted again, "No, not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a rebel. We'll stop there. Amen. Why that became so significant and remains significant for Black theology, even as we speak in our present day, is that one of the ways in which white supremacy, white power, the power of empire and the power of white European thinking, how that's put a gloss onto the scriptures, that therefore makes Black theology sound like this really dangerously heretical movement, when actually the dangerous heretical movement is British Christianity. And the reason why I say that is simply this. In the text, Jesus is confronted by Pilate. The whole of the New Testament is against the backdrop of Roman imperialism. Jesus himself is a colonized, oppressed Jew. Pontius Pilate is a Roman governor. He is an imperial apparatchik who's been sent by Rome in order to control this particular province that's part of the Roman Empire. One of the most amazing things that has always struck me ever since I started studying Black theology is every time I sit in a service at Easter in any church in Britain, and predominantly, if I'm going to be blunt, white ministers get up and we read this text and we imagine ourselves to be Jesus. We're not Jesus, we're Pontius Pilate. Britain had an empire in which the equivalent of Pontius Pilate controls indigenous or native peoples to the point whereby, as the Jewish people say themselves, they can't even execute one of their own because only Rome has the power of life and death. That was still the case in many parts of the Caribbean. That was part of in many parts of the Caribbean where, for example, if one wanted to put someone to death, not that I'm in favor of the death penalty at all, but actually one had to send to Britain and get permission from the Privy Council in order to execute someone, because the ultimate power of life and death lay with the colonial power structures through a Governor General who's equivalent of Pontius Pilate. If you want to know the power of whiteness to overlay and to distort the gospel, then simply look at how we see this text and identify with Jesus, even although he himself is the equivalent of marginalized and oppressed peoples. He does not represent imperial power. He does not represent the exploitative nature of empire that imposes itself upon other people and makes them second-class and third-class citizens in their own country, which is exactly what the British did under the guise of Christianity. Yet Black theology gets attacked for being dangerous and heretical by the very type of white Christian Anglicans who were probably in favor of empire in the first place. The roots of Black theology coming from the scriptures lie in a God who identifies with people who are oppressed and marginalized. So long before James Cone eventually writes it down, so Cone writes the first Black theology book in 1969 called Black Theology and Black Power. And Cone says, well, the Black Power movement was more Christian than many white churches that worshipped a God that confirmed slavery and confirmed Jim Crow and confirmed separation between white and black, and forced Black people to sit at the back of the bus and have an inferior life experience. The continued work of Black theology in terms of engaging really with the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, for me, has been about how we retell the story of British history. Here we are in Black History Month, in order to show the intricacies and the ways in which the past continues to speak into the present in terms of the issues around empire and the issues around exploitation and the legacy of colonialism. So let me just give another quick example now. In 2007, we marked the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade, not the end of slavery, but the slave trade itself was ended in 1807. And Britain was the first country to do that. Slavery itself was not ended entirely until 1838. But in 1807, the making of new slaves came to an end, and there was a number of set-all-free services organized ecumenically up and down the country, largely through my brother, Richard Reddie, who was the coordinator of the set-all-free project. I was asked to preach in Bristol at Bristol Cathedral at their ecumenical set-all-free service. Now, it's one of those situations whereby I still look back on it and I still have a number of very mixed emotions about taking part in that event. Firstly, if I had realized how controversial it was, I might not have accepted the invitation, because it's the only time I've ever walked through a picket line. So outside the cathedral, there's about 30 or 40 strong people, mainly Black people, but some white activists as well, who are complaining about the hypocrisy of a service organized by the Anglican Diocese in a city in which, up to that point in 2007, as I will explain in a moment, there was still a civic service in Bristol for the life of Edward Colston. That's the slave trader whose statue was pulled down and thrown into the harbour last year. I wasn't aware of the picket I walked through it as the only Black person in the pretty much all-white procession of people who were processing into the cathedral, and I preached the sermon. My family, I have family who live in Bristol. They said that they supported me doing it because they said in the end, Christianity is fundamentally about reconciliation. It's the reconciliation of the work of Christ on the cross that brings us into a state of grace with God. And obviously, it's also reconciliation between individuals as well, in the power of the Spirit. And for me, I guess with better hindsight, I probably would still do it because I'm still a Christian theologian, and therefore I think reconciliation is still an important matter to which the church needs to attend. But anyway, I preached a sermon, but I was aware only afterwards of the complex politics of the city. Edward Colston was a notorious slave trader. He made billions, not millions, billions in today's money. So much so that being a communicant member of the Church of England, he gave significant amounts of money to his local parish church. He gave significant amounts of money to the city. There are a number of schools and concert halls and public buildings named after him. Colston. So much so that soon after his death, they built a statue in honor of all the great work he did. But nowhere on the statue and nowhere in any of the public remembrances of him is there anything that says that the man was a slave trader. So from 1720 through to 2016, think about that date, 1720 to 2016, there was a public memorial service for him held in the parish church in Bristol, in which people would process in honor of this great man, who is a slave trader. It is reckoned that he shipped somewhere in the region of 100,000 people from the west coast of Africa into the Americas. And the most egregious thing about it, if that wasn't bad enough, is that he gave clear instructions to the ship captains of the ships that he owned, that if on board there were enslaved people who were sick or emaciated, not in good health, if there was individuals like that, clearly those people would not at market make for a good sale. In which case, there were clear instructions to the captains to throw their bodies overboard in order that he could claim on the insurance. And it's reckoned that 1 in 5 people were thrown overboard. It's why some black academics don't talk about the Atlantic, we call it the Black Atlantic. We don't know how many bodies lie at the bottom of that stretch of water across a 300-year period of enslavement. 1720 to 2016. My family who live in Bristol, or part of my family who live in Bristol, along with many of the activists, have been complaining many years that let's move the statue. So long before it was thrown down, people were saying, well, let's just move it because it really is offensive to have a statue here and to hold this guy up as a hero who was a slave trader who made his billions peddling in black flesh is quite frankly offensive to the sensibilities of those of us who are the descendants of enslaved Africans. And the city council said no, didn't care, because he was a hero. Hero to white people who have benefited predominantly more so than black people in terms of his legacy of giving money, and certainly a hero to the Church of England, given that he was a communicant member of the Church of England and was Anglican. As recently as 2 or 3 years ago, again, long before people pulled this down, people said, well, at the very least, let's put a plaque up. Let's have a plaque there that says he was a slave trader. So at least there is some recognition as to how he made this money. And apparently the city council said no, because if we put a plaque up, that will impugn his reputation. But he was a slave trader. And the Anglican Diocese had nothing to say about this. Interesting enough, actually, when he gets pulled down now and thrown into the harbour, suddenly everyone's upset about law and order. And it was also about property, which tells me that actually what has not changed in the best part of 300 years, even since slavery has ended, is that property and money matter more than Black people's feelings. Black theology is a theology of liberation. Does two key things. Firstly, it is a theology that affirms Blackness, that in a world, even when as recently as COVID, where we've seen that this has been a great revealer, that systemic racism plays a major part in who dies and who doesn't. And even then, interesting, the first excuse people began to put forward for why the proportionate number of Black and Asian people were dying was that, is it something to do with our genes? And it's really interesting that on the basis of slavery was the notion that somehow there was an inbuilt inferiority into Black people of African descent that made us right for slavery and made it acceptable for us to be slaves. And that was based on notions of racial theory, that like we had different genes and different biology. And it's interesting, even though all that's been disproved, worthless idea, there's only one race, that's the human race. Interesting how those ideas still slip back in. So when we're looking for an explanation for why the proportionate number of Black people are dying, people still go back to the same old racial theories that were disproved over 50 years ago. There are no fundamental biological differences between Black and white people. If something were to happen to me, it's just as likely that a white person sitting on Zoom here could be a transplant donor or someone who could give me blood or someone in my own family, because there's no Black blood or white blood. There's no Black organs and white organs. There's only one race, that's the human race. And yet, despite knowing that, racial theory still came back in as an excuse initially to try to explain why it is that Black people were dying disproportionately. No, we're dying disproportionately because of systemic racism. If you live in crap housing and if you're overcrowded and you do the kind of work where you can't self-isolate, then you will die. More so than if you're white and predominantly middle class and you do the kind of job where you can work from home. That theology affirms the reality of Blackness. It says, in the midst of our oppression and our continued struggles with an immigration system that can still deport Black people who have been here for 60, 70 years as British subjects, and those people are still waiting for justice. There are still people I know who have been deported who can't get back into the country yet. And at least one faithful Anglican guy, whose name I won't mention for respect to his family, was a member of the Church of England for the best part of 60 years in this country, coming as a young boy, who was deported back to the country where technically he was born, but had not been back since he was 2 years old. And he died of a heart attack, given the stress and the shock. There's no compensation for him. That's the nature of systemic injustice in this country. And Black theology affirms Blackness and says that in the midst of our oppression, God is with us, just as God was with those enslaved Hebrews in the Old Testament. And God has always been on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed. But the other part of the work has always been to critique white privilege and entitlement. And what I mean by entitlement, I mean, at the very least, even for some of the poorest and most marginalized white working class people in Britain, for which I do not dispute that those are real experiences. Entitlement means that you wake up and whatever problems that face you in the day, all of which there are many, being white is not one of them. It allows you, therefore, to have encounters with the police where you are less likely to end up dying in police custody because you're white, but that will happen if you're Black. At the very least, white entitlement is the ability never to have to think about it. And yet being Black is also having to wrestle with the fact that your body is never neutral. So even though I have the fancy title as a professor, I'm an extraordinary professor. I still have that experience of walking into certain Oxford colleges, and even though I'm wearing the gown, the porters are still looking at me as if whether I belonged or not. So even the other day, I'm walking in with a colleague who walks in and he doesn't need to show his card. And I'm walking in and the porter physically pulls me back and says, but where are you going? To which my white colleague now looks embarrassed because he knows full well that he just walked through and the porter never even looked twice at him. That's the nature of white entitlement. And for too long, most white people have been oblivious to its existence and had nothing to say. What I'm hoping now, as I conclude, is that post-George Floyd, with a report from the Church of England, from lament to action, and with my involvement in the Archbishop's Commission for Racial Justice, of which I've been asked to be a part of that we will be there will be much greater sensitivity to the fact that we live in a skewed, unjust world. And the message and the good news of Jesus Christ is for all of us to repent and to be transformed in the power of the Spirit, but be transformed in a way that recognizes that the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition always has a preferential option for those who are marginalized and oppressed, and calls us to speak truth to power. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you. So Anthony's kindly left us some time for questions. So if you have a question, either wave at us or you can use the reactions button that you will see in front of you and raise your hand in that way. So thank you again, Anthony. Does anyone have any questions, comments? Anyone at all? Samson, can you unmute, Samson?
Thank you very much, Anthony. It was very, very informative. Thank you. I think my question is this: where do we go from here?
Yeah, okay. Well, so I will offer three very, very brief perspectives that I think are very much within the gift of God to us in terms of being church, in terms of how we change. First, in one sense, we are doing that in terms of the Church of England. So this Archbishop's as a commissioner, which I'm a part, our job is to try and to help the church to implement the findings from the report from lament to action. And the idea is, I think, is for it to act a bit like yeast. I still have memories of when I was young, like my mom used to make bread. And the thing I was surprised at was how little yeast it took to raise a whole amount of flour. And hopefully what we're hoping is that the report will act like yeast. It will infiltrate the whole of the systemic way in which the church operates and begin to create better practices and policies and make us more self-conscious of the way in which not just race, but class and gender and disability and other isms have always infected the church and stopped us from being the greater expression of the kingdom as we would like to believe ourselves to be. So that's the first thing, is broader systemic change. I mean, that won't happen overnight. That if the report does its work, hopefully we'll see some of the benefits in 5, 10, 15 years time. So that's longer term. At a kind of intermediate way, and I said that you're clergy, so let me just be really kind of pointed in terms of what you can do. But one of the things that Black theology has shown, and most recently the work of Willie James Jennings in a book called After Whiteness, that I would recommend everyone to buy, After Whiteness by Willie James Jennings, is that he shows that practices and procedures and systems are never neutral. They benefit particular groups of people or they disadvantage others. And there's no such thing as a neutral practice. And so much of what we do as church has been developed around some of the experiences and insights, particularly of white middle-class people. So not even white working-class people. So this is not just all white people. This is particularly, let's say, book learning university graduate people. That's how we do church. And so at the very least, what I say to people is, part of what you can do is to do an audit and just ask yourself, why do we do what we do? Why do we do it this way, and who benefits from it and who doesn't? Just take two very quick examples. We are still wedded to doing service at a particular time on a Sunday morning on the assumption that that fits everyone. And of course it doesn't. So for example, I know in some places, well, I'll give an example. So for a number of years, I worked in Manchester, and in one of the Anglican churches in Moss Side, it was interesting in that you would get a certain number of people, but never the same people every week, because people did shift work. And so one of the things that the church, I think, needs to wrestle with is to think about in what other ways do we do church that enables people whose lifestyles economically are not the ones that fit a particular pattern in terms of when we do church on a particular day at a certain time. Secondly, and the other one very quickly, is about how we then do business. So much of how we do our business in terms of meetings assumes a certain type of learning style, and even again assumes a certain lifestyle. So we usually meet on an evening, usually about 6:30, 7:30, something like that. Someone like you chairs a meeting that we have a linear agenda, and we go through the agenda, and it assumes that people can sit there, take information, cogitate it, think about it, and then come back with a response so that when we finish that business, we then move on. And the thing I've sometimes said is, actually, if you're thinking about more inclusive ways of working, what we need are agendas that are not linear, but are circular. So you have a piece of business, you make a provisional decision, you move on, but then as in a circle, like you can go back to it and say, okay, so about an hour ago, we made this decision. Are we still thinking that's what we have imagined? Or in the meantime, guess what? Has the Holy Spirit maybe said something to someone? Because our way of working assumes that once we've had like a very quick conversation, like the Holy Spirit will only speak to you in those 5 minutes whilst we got a quick conflab before we then move on and never come back. Those are not rocket science things, but they're meant for greater equity in terms of people's ability to participate in the life of the church. Finally, is to quote Gandhi, who says that all of us can be the change we want to see in the world. And by that, I simply mean is that most of us may not get to change the world in terms of system and structures. And most people in churches are not clergy like yourself, Samson, so therefore don't have an official role that can influence things. But actually, every one of us can be a disciple in terms of how we engage with other people that reflects the values of the kingdom, that says that we will love our neighbor as ourselves, irrespective of what the neighbor looks like and who they are. That's not rocket science, that's not critical race theory, that's just the gospel. And actually, that's what every one of us can do. We can be the change we want to see in the world. So those three areas, I think.
Thank you, Anthony. Do we have any other questions, comments, or observations? I have a message here from Tracy. Yeah. What books would you recommend on Black theology? Black theology, introductory and ongoing.
Okay, now to my utter shame, and I take no pride in this, but I'll say it anyway. I would say buy one of my books. Okay, yeah, I know, self-regarding, I apologize. But yes, but generally, so my book called Is God Colorblind? Is God Colorblind? It was first published in 2009, but then republished last year by a very enterprising publisher who wanted to cash in on post George Floyd. It sells for a reasonable price, unlike the Brexit book. I hate to say it, probably, that like you won't be able to afford that anytime soon. It's ridiculous amount of money. That's just capitalism gone mad. I apologize. However, it's called Colorblind. It's on about 130 pages. It's a relatively small book, and it was written as a very accessible introduction to Black theology, particularly aimed at people in churches involved in ministry and ordinary Christian discipleship. So that's the book I would encourage.
Thank you, Anthony. Anthony, do you have access to the chat?
Yes, I do.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. So where's the other one? Right. Okay. Yeah. I find it interesting that much of the Bible content is formed out of the trauma of being the oppressed covenant people rather than the oppressive empires, Babylon, Rome, etc. And when Israel gains wealth, God warns them gravely not to be like Babylon. So my question is, do you think that God favors a kind of theological reading too? A theological hermeneutic of resistance to anti-creation, to anti-doxological empire. In other words, should the church prioritize the ways in which we oppress, ways in which the oppressed read in terms of scripture? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things I take from that, and this is one of the things important to realize about Black theology, that Black theology is not nationalistic. So when Cohn says that God has a preferential option for Black people, it's because we're oppressed. Now, here's the thing. If we oppress other people, then that option goes away. It's that God favors Israel because they are elect, because they're oppressed, and God says that you're my people. When they oppress other people, then God's favor goes. Therefore, it seems to me that clearly what we have to do is always to be on the side of those who are marginalized and oppressed. What makes it difficult for the church is that once we became, I say we as a Christian, that once Constantine converts to Christianity, and we are no longer on the other side of empire, we're part of empire itself, a crucial dimension of what it is to be church gets lost. And we've been struggling to find it ever since. And for me, therefore, I often say that what we have to try and be is, at our best, is to be enemies within our own church. So, and by that, I mean, so even the Methodists, like we like to think that it's the Church of England who are the villains, you know. I'm like, we were much, as Methodists, like, we're on the better side of history and we didn't consort with empire, and we're much more on the side of the proletariat. Nonsense. We like to believe that about ourselves. It's not true. We colluded as much as anyone else does, and we would love to have the power of the Church of England. We don't, so therefore like we pretend that, but, you know, we really hate you, but we don't. We just envy you. Part of the prophetic witness, and it's interesting in that throughout the scriptures, you always get those individuals who are speaking truth to power. Who the truth is are never liked during their lifetime, but people love them after once they're dead and gone, you know? I suspect that long after I've gone, even all the people on Twitter who hated me will tell the world what a wonderful person I was. Oh, wasn't Auntie Reddie so good, actually, even at the time, actually, when they disliked me. There was something about the prophetic presence of people in the midst of the existing status quo who were always there to call us to account. So within the Church of England, one of my great heroes when I was growing up and doing my theological work was Ken Leach. Ken Leach never held high office, was never trusted with any great authority. He was a bit of a curmudgeonly, awkward bugger, it has to be said. Not the easiest person to get to know. But his writings, if you read his work, he is the most acceptable face of the Church of England, I think, in the last 30 years in terms of speaking truth to power and standing up for those on the margins and really pushing unpopular causes. And saying actually it's in the midst of the people who are unpopular and the people who we're told don't matter that we see God revealed. It's no accident that Jesus himself is born in Nazareth, which is the equivalent of one of the kind of like worst ghettos in our large city. So much so that even that famous phrase, I think from Nicodemus, it says actually, oh, no, I was getting it wrong. Sorry, it's not Nicodemus. But anyway, there's that quote when someone sort of says actually, can anything good come from Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? Well, yes, it can actually. Like the Son of God comes from Nazareth. Therefore, that's where we should be looking for God's presence in terms of where God is being revealed amongst the people who come from the places where people might say, can anything good come from that place?
Thank you, Anthony. Anybody else? And do feel free to put it in the chat. Yes, Janet.
Yeah. Hi, Anthony. Thank you so much for that really thought-provoking, maybe uncomfortable at times presentation. Hugely informative. I just touched on one of the phrases that you used, that there's one race, and that's the human race. And it just made me reflect on Ephesians 4, what that talks about. There's one body, you know, and everything about that. And I just wondered whether there's any, like maybe one specific action that you felt that we need to take. I'm thinking that, you know, this Zoom call and this webinar is wonderful, and there's quite a few people on here, but not quite as many as we would hope would be really maybe intrigued in finding out more, especially during, you know, this month of Black History Month that, as you say, should be more than 1 month, should be ongoing. But is there anything specific that you think that we need to do in order to engage more people?
Yeah. Actually, I know that there are a number of study groups. So when, let me go back as well to the question about is there an introductory book people can read? Okay, so putting aside my book, that was very self-serving. A really useful one, particularly for Anglicans, is Azariah Franz Williams' book, Ghost Ship. And the positive thing I think you can do is to get people to buy that book and to have a reading group. So Azariah Franz is an Anglican priest, Black Anglican priest, born in Leeds, parents from the Caribbean, part of the Windrush generation like myself, but they're quite a bit younger than me. I think he's in his early 30s. And basically what he does, it's part autobiography, part tells a story growing up in the Church of England and the racism he's faced. And the reason why it's difficult is because, for the most part, the British are very polite, especially the English. Like, we don't go in there, say, like, for scrawling, burning crosses onto people's lawns and stuff. A lot of the time, it's a small microaggressions of people just questioning whether you belong and questioning your legitimacy, or seeing you as less than, that just wears you down. There's a reason why, for example, Black people are 6 times more likely to have mental health issues in this country than anyone else. It's the microaggressions that eventually literally send you mad. And so what he does is he talks about his journey and then offers challenges for how the Church of England in particular can be more inclusive. I think, and certainly I would encourage a number of churches that if you have reading groups, and have a reading group and read the book together. And then on the basis of that, then say, okay, so having read this book, what are we going to do in our church? What are we going to do to be different? How are we going to take the witness of this? Because Azariah is critical, but he loves the church. I'm critical, but I love the church. I'm still a Christian theologian because in the end of the day, it's not about who we are, it's about who God is in Jesus Christ. And first and foremost, I think what Azariah says, and for me, actually, what I say about is God colorblind? It is this thing about, are we willing to allow the Spirit to transform our understanding of ourselves, so much so that when we see the other, and the other come in lots of guises, we see Christ. So essentially, we don't see problems, we don't see people to fix, we don't see things to manage. We see gifts that God has given us to be in solidarity with each other.
Amen to that. I did have a question, and we've only got 3 minutes left, so I'll make it brief.
Yeah.
My question is about the eggshells. I'm not very good at treading on eggshells, but I seem to be coming across people all the time, and specifically within my role, where eggshells are placed in front of me. What do we do about those eggshells?
If I'm going to be blunt, like, we just stamp all over them. And the reason I say that is that often, like, the eggshells are forms of distraction. They're ways of trying to circumvent conversations that people don't want to have. And they're ways of trying to prevent the work of justice from happening. So when people start saying, oh yes, but I'll get upset. So what? So getting upset is not the worst thing that can happen in the world. And actually, maybe it's from that upset, it's from that disturbance that good news happens. So one of the great things I take for one of my theological heroes, who some of you may be familiar with, the great German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer really was the one who chided the church for its desire to want to have cheap grace. So cheap grace is where you want transformation without struggle and without discomfort and without pain. To quote the obvious, you don't get Easter Sunday without having Good Friday. And there's no change that can happen without going through the cross. And so therefore, what I often now say to people is, I might apologize in advance and say, I'm sorry that you're going to feel upset. But I believe it's through the disturbance of the cross and the truth of pain and struggle and injustice that transformation will come. There's this great quote. Let me end with this great quote. This is one of my great heroes, is James Baldwin. And James Baldwin says this. He says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
That's a perfect quote to end on. So Professor Anthony Reddie, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this evening, for your frank and open presentation. And I'd like to thank all of you who have taken the time to join us and participate. This will be live on YouTube if you know anyone who's missed it. We did have 40 people signed up, but I think that because the main event was postponed, people probably thought that this was postponed too. So I'll make sure that Mondays is clear that it's running. But for now, Anthony, thank you so much. I think you're a real inspiration. And thank all of you for joining us. And I'm sure that if you have any questions, that Anthony wouldn't mind me sending them on at some point if you think of something at a later date. Will that be all right? Great. Thank you very much. God be with you all. Have a pleasant evening and hopefully see you on Monday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Anthony. Thank you so much. That was great. It's a real pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.